All right, welcome back to another episode of the Jim Laird Show. Dr. Stillman and I are banging out a couple episodes here since we have a little bit of free time, which we normally don't have. But if you haven't checked out our first show, which was all about the immune system and how the environment drives your immune system, I will have a link below. This will be on YouTube. It'll also be on the podcast. So check that out. So Dr. Stillman and I have been friends for just over a year.
Yeah.
We met at a Dr. Kruse member retreat down in Mexico. Dr. Stillman likes to play his guitar on the beach. We became friends, and we chat quite often, back and forth, giving each other kind of ideas, and we just kind of banter back and forth. And Dr. Stillman is one of the most logical, rational, well-researched people I've met. And,
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I just call it the way I see it. But we're going to dive down a rabbit hole here, and here's the disclaimer again. This is not medical advice. Okay, this is for information purposes only, so you can do your own research. You can come to your own conclusions, and you can consult with your own doctor and figure out what is best for you. But, you know, there's this big controversy now about 5G and about cell phones and about, you know, radiation. And I think the thing that most people don't understand is that, you know, the method that we're using to talk right now, all it is a light frequency, you know, a light frequency that we cannot see. And to think that certain frequencies of light don't have consequences, I think is a little bit naive. And then, of course, you're going to have people that are just going to laugh and scoff and like, there's not enough research, all that kind of stuff. So Dr. Stillman and I are going to kind of dive into this, and we're going to put out a bunch of information that you can go check for yourself, and then you can learn. Basically, we can talk about how to mitigate this stuff and how to live in our modern world and how to, you know, basically mitigate this risk of this awesome technology that has its benefits, but also has its downsides. So you want to take it off from there? Like what? So Dr.
Sure.
Stillman, how did you kind of get into this, the whole non-native EMF? I mean, maybe explain what it is.
How did I fall down this rabbit hole?
Yeah, how did we fall down this rabbit hole? And
yeah,
when did this start becoming part of our,
right,
you know, our culture, and how has it kind of evolved, and what does the research say, and on and on and on and on.
So let's define basically some terms. So what we're going to talk about today is microwave and radio wave radiations of light. So most people think of light as something that hits their eye and creates a signal to their brain, and they can see it, right? But there's a lot of light that we can't see. And, you know, the light is defined by frequency and wavelength. And the different frequencies of light have different energies, which is why, you know, you can go outside on a bright day with a lot of UV light and get sunburned. But if you go outside on a winter day when there's no UV light, you can stay outside all day and never get sunburned. So the power density of light really is very important to its effects on life. And there's the visible spectrum, which is what a lot of the sunlight is. Below that, 42% of sunlight is infrared light, which we sense as heat. And to be clear, not all heat is infrared light, but, you know, when infrared light hits your skin, you perceive it as heat. And then below that, there's microwave radiation, and then there's radio wave radiation. And radio and microwave radiation you can't see, and strictly speaking, you don't have a good way of sensing it, although it does have biological effects. And, you know, the radio really, I mean, you know, before the 19 teens, when Marconi invented the radio, we didn't have any kind of wireless communication. We had the telegraph. We were just getting started with electricity. And then Marconi invented the radio and figured out that if you vibrated an antenna, or basically a piece of metal, at a certain frequency, and you tuned another piece of metal to that frequency, right, you could pick up the signal and you could demodulate it and you could create, maybe I'm using the wrong words because I'm not an EMF engineer, right? But you could, transmit signals via the air. And this was a revolution in technology because obviously militaries, governments, corporations realized that if they could transmit information instantaneously without having to spend infrastructure or money on infrastructure to create things like telegraphs or telephone wires, they could make massive amounts of money. Politicians gravitated towards this for spreading the message of what they were all about. It just took off. We love communicating. We're very communicative.
Sports teams, the whole.
Yeah, exactly. The sky is the limit still. The reality though is that people didn't, were not well equipped to examine the health effects of this. Even the earliest radio towers, there were studies of the health effects on workers who were working on them. I don't have the exact details, but Dr. Jack Kruse did a webinar on this. I think it was one of his earliest webinars, and it's a really fantastic deep dive into this stuff. And if you become a member of his website and get access to his webinars, you don't need to subscribe to him forever. You can get this and you can listen to it. I'm going to break down, kind of my take on this here. A lot of which I've learned from him as well as other resources over the years. So here's the key thing for people that I always point out to people about these frequencies of light. Since 1918, public health has gotten much, much, much worse. And yes, we've changed our food. Yes, we've moved indoors. Yes, we've disconnected from nature. We've changed many, many things about how we live. But we cannot dismiss the role of radio and microwave radiations in our lives in having effects on our health. Because this began as just, you had a radio tower down the street and you might tune into the radio an hour or half an hour a night, or maybe you go down to the corner store and you listen to the radio with everybody else because you were too broke to own one. And now it's everybody's got a computer in the palm of their hand that communicates with a cell phone tower. And if you compare the strength of that signal to the early radios, it doesn't even register. And to give people some scale of the scope, right? Like if you had a factory down the street from your house that was emitting fumes into the air and blotting out the sun, you would notice it. But you can live right next to a massive microwave or radio wave transmission station where if you can measure the levels, they're like astronomical, way higher than anything we find in nature, right? And you would never realize this unless it affected your health and you began to do some digging into the effects of these things. Now, we've done research into the effects of these things, and the first thing I point out to the skeptics is this. Life uses light from the infrared to the ultraviolet spectrum. Life can create ultraviolet light, it can create all the different colors of the visible spectrum, and it can create infrared light. And life never uses the microwave or radio wave radiation frequencies for any reason.
So when you say, let's kind of stop there for a second, because I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
But most people don't. When you say life can create light, what do you mean by that?
Sure. So all chemical reactions, any chemical reaction, which people think of, they think about burning glucose or burning fat, and people talk about burning things all the time, right? Well, think about the word burn, right? When you light up a cigarette, there's a light that gets emitted from the burning end of the cigarette. Right. And so people think of very casually about burning ketones or burning glucose or burning protein or whatever. And they're not realizing that what's really happening is not just a change in the substrate, the carbons and hydrogens and nitrogens and shuffling around protons and electrons, but light is being emitted or absorbed in those interactions. And when you go back into the literature in nutrition, it's very telling to realize that a lot of the nutritional diseases or deficiencies that people have had over the years, I'm thinking specifically of pellagra or niacin deficiency, people developed skin rashes when they were deficient in niacin on predominantly their sun-exposed skin. And so this completely eludes most people in health and wellness. They pay no attention to the light side of the health, question. And I look at it like Einstein's equation, E equals mc squared, right? So energy equals mass times the acceleration or the speed of light squared, right? basically what that equation says is that light equals food. And we know that light has powerful effects on life. And here's just a couple of examples, right? The heat that our bodies produce so that we're normal, we have a normal temperature, right? It's being produced by chemical reactions going on in our cells by the movement of protons and electrons through our mitochondria. And our mitochondria can actually emit light through these pathways.
And that's why infrared, that's why infrared sights
Right.
and scopes in the military, your body actually gives off light, which
Exactly.
I don't think most people realize that. Most people don't understand that at all.
Right, exactly. And so life makes red and infrared light basically on demand. When you're shivering, what you're really doing is you're burning energy to create heat in the form of light.
You're setting a fire in your body, a controlled fire.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is one reason why, I mean, when like people should think about it this way, positron emission tomography or PET scanning, right? It's measuring glucose uptake in different parts of the body. It's measuring metabolic activity. And when you make somebody cold, you turn on their brown fat to burn glucose. These are changes in the light status of the body, if you will, or life is manipulating light in order to survive in a harsh environment. And when cells divide, they actually do so by emitting ultraviolet type C light, which is, most doctors and scientists don't know that. They don't read that literature, but it's very thought-provoking to realize that unbeknownst to most people, life has this whole other side, this whole other dimension that's way beyond the carbons and the nitrogens and the chemicals that are constantly making headlines in the mainstream media, the news, whatever. Everyone's trying to sell you a bottle full of stuff. And honestly, most of them are trying to sell you a bottle full of stuff because it's a lot easier to package than light. And so life can create light. And you see this all over the place. I mean, we could talk about just that for an hour. And it never picks up the microwave and radio wave radiations to use them for any reason. And that's really telling because life doesn't give up a free lunch. If life can find a way to utilize an energy source and gain an advantage, it will do that, no matter what.
Where do microwave and those sort of things exist in nature?
Right. So these frequencies are bouncing around the galaxy, and they can come down to Earth, but they're mostly blocked by our atmosphere or ionosphere.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is that most people don't know this, but there's something called radio astronomy, where astronomers will look not at visible light coming from the galaxy and space. They'll look at radio and microwave signatures from space.
Right.
And we have a national radio astronomy or radio telescope in West Virginia.
And they don't allow Wi-Fi and all that other stuff in the area because it interferes.
It's in what's called the dead zone, and that dead zone is mandated by the federal government to allow for the study of space in this way. And people in that area cannot have Wi-Fi, cannot have cell phones. There's no cell phone towers. You have to use pay phones because if they were to install that infrastructure, then people would interfere with the ability of the scientists to study, nature. And so people don't realize we're putting out huge, and I'm talking orders of magnitude, like millions and billions and trillions and septillions times as much microwave and radio wave radiation into our environment as is actually present in nature. And really, this is just the latest kind of segment in our love affair with technology, which no matter what epoch of human history you go to, creates problems. Some of the earliest records of really occupational health came to us from ancient Rome, where they noticed that the people who worked with lead occupationally, making lead pipes and other lead devices, ended up sickly and anemic and had poor health, and they developed a lot of diseases. Fast forward a little bit, and you see that people who were in the fur trading or fur like hat making business, hatters, right? The phrase "mad as a hatter" which I think, funnily enough, kids may not even know these days, but there's a term, mad as a hatter, and it comes from the fact that hatters used mercury-laden agents to make hats, and the mercury accumulated in the brain and poisoned the brain, and it made them literally mad.
Nuts.
And
Yeah.
so, we always love to manipulate the environment that we're in order to find advantages, but we can create these hidden liabilities that we don't become aware of until far after the fact. And in a lot of cases, it's industry that covers up the links because they have a really significant need. And in the case of microwave and radio wave radiation, the reason that these links were covered up is that the military was concerned about America's ability to project power on the global stage and compete in the Cold War against the Russians, who, and historically, communist nations have had a very poor record in terms of protecting the environment. Obviously, they don't protect the health of their citizens. They allow them to to live in absolutely horrible conditions. And this was basically used as a excuse by the federal government and the military industrial complex to say, we're going to allow unmitigated expansion of these technologies in order to protect America. And we're not going to inform the public of these dangers, which are well established in the military's own literature, because we can't afford to leave these military tools, unused, because we might
become a disadvantage.
Right, we might be in a disadvantage in an armed conflict. And this then ended up translating into consumer electronics and consumer goods. And if you look at the relationship between really the military and government funded technology and research, there's an incestuous relationship between them and the private sector. And really,
the iPhone is just a military device. They took all the tools from the military and just packaged them into one big package. He didn't invent
GPS,
anything, just packaged it.
Right, GPS was developed for the military. And this is part of really the decline of freedom in our country, and people don't realize that it's all being played to take away. One side's really being played against the other, Democrats against Republicans, with the same agenda. Every year, my whole life, I've watched it happen. They want to restrict our rights, restrict our freedoms. They want to shut down doctors like me who tell the truth about these things, and they want to create a system where the corporations are making all the money. Average business owners cannot compete because there's so many regulations, so many taxes, so many rules. And that's, part of why this, current coronavirus problem is such a big problem. We don't have a very resilient economy because the government's made it so hard to be a small business owner. And now they're going to bail out all the big corporations, which is a whole other story. But this is just, people need to understand those big businesses are the same, it's really like the big tobacco of our time is big tech and their wireless radiation. They make so much money off of selling you cell phones and wireless routers and smart televisions and smart devices. It's just the latest wave of consumer goods runs on these frequencies, and it's a way for, really the economic elite to make huge amounts of money without disclosing the real health effects to the average consumer,
or the effect, the fact that they are creating a surveillance society. And
correct. Absolutely.
They can track your every move. They can track what you buy, what websites you go to.
Right.
Or like in Israel right now, and in London, they're literally tracking you on your phone. And if you leave your house and you disobey the quarantine, you get a little message that says you've been fined $30 for violating your quarantine. And then we've got China, who has a camera on every corner.
Right.
And if you play by the rules of the government, then you're allowed to do X, Y, Z. And if you don't, then you don't get to do X, Y, Z. So
right.
that's a scary, scary thing that most people don't even think about.
Yeah. And there's no checks on these powers. And who knows how that data is being collected, who it's being shared with. And it's kind of the ultimate competitive advantage for people who can get a seat at the table to that kind of data that the government's collecting. Because if the government tells you what consumer behavior is, you can make a killing,
right.
selling them whatever you want.
Right.
And Facebook can make or break businesses. And we've seen people like Rob Wolf report huge declines in traffic to his website because of what is basically the thought police telling people what to think.
Well, you and I both have had, articles pulled down here
Yeah,
recently
right.
because, Mark Zuckerberg or whoever
Yep,
deemed that they weren't, appropriate. And
right.
so, and that's the thing, like people forget, like over time, look at the things, like if you go back, if you search on YouTube and you search in like cigarette advertisements, they had doctors literally on TV telling people that smoking cigarettes was good for your health. It relaxed you. It,
Right,
all these things. Like look at the margarine fiasco. Look at the, don't
right,
eat fat, don't eat eggs, don't eat
right.
butter. Look at all these. I mean, they used to put cocaine in Coca-Cola. I mean, they
Yep.
used to give, women in World War II methamphetamines to make them feel better. Um, I mean, just look on and on and on and on to the stuff. I mean, look at the mistakes there's been in physics that, everything that was taught in physics for like the last, 50 years, all of a sudden turned out to be wrong.
Right.
Um, and then we've got a group of elite people that are going to censor all the information that's out there, deemed on whatever the experts, what in the 70s, they said we were going to be in an ice age right now. And now they're saying we're going to melt.
Right.
So it, you know, it's constantly, um, changing, and you have to evaluate these facts and look at these things and observe things for yourself. And we're basically marching into this fascist state. And everybody's doing it lovingly and wholeheartedly, and this is great. And look at all these great things we have, but eventually, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but our freedoms are going to be gone because somebody can just say, well, you don't want to play by the rules, then you're not part of the system. And then you
Yeah.
don't have the ability to take care of yourself because you don't have the ability to grow your own food. You don't have the ability to do all these things. And you're basically forced into the system because you have no other way to exist.
Right. And, I think what's interesting about this time in particular is that right now we're kind of seeing the music stop for a lot of people. The paychecks aren't coming in, the small businesses are on the rocks. And what people need to realize right now, maybe more than ever, is that the things that they're being sold and told make them happy through clever marketing are not actually make them happy. I mean, I find it ironic as a physician that I take care of people with depression day in and day out. And yet these are people who can go on their iPhone and have whatever food they want delivered right to their door for, I mean, think about that. There are kings and emperors and dictators who don't have access to the things that the average American consumer takes for granted. And
Right.
yet people are miserable. And what's ironic about this is when you look at the actual neurochemistry of happiness, right? What does it depend upon? It depends upon normal levels of and healthy balances of hormones, neurotransmitters, and healthy production of energy in our mitochondria. And what determines these basic factors, which I could elaborate on, extensively about all the details, right? But at the heart of this issue is really the fact that the things that optimize those levels and that balance in our system is not all this stuff that you can buy on Amazon or the information that's getting, that is hitting your eyeballs from Facebook or Instagram. It is things that you find for free in nature. And people need that message now more than ever because guess what? No matter what happens to the dollar tomorrow, no matter what comes in as far as your paycheck tomorrow, you can go start a garden and you can buy seeds for, pennies per seed. And you can garden and you can be happy outside in nature. I mean, people garden as a hobby. I find it deeply ironic that people are unhappy in a time when they can make money to have hobbies that people used to consider to be work. Like what
Yeah.
we consider to be fun,
Survival.
right, used to be, something you had to do in order to survive. So if you think about it, there's never been a better time to get into things, to basically self-sufficiency and survivalism, foraging your own food, hunting your own food, fishing your own food, gardening in your own garden. These are really, this is our evolutionary heritage that we are hardwired to enjoy. And people think they enjoy video games and, all the various devices of modernity, and they don't. They like those things the same way that an addict likes alcohol or cocaine. It
Right.
feels good now,
Well, it's
but
the same.
wait,
It's the
6
same
hours.
mechanism, right? The more you hit that
Exactly.
dopamine level, the more you hit
Same,
that dopamine
same.
trigger,
Yeah,
you just feel empty. You
right,
more and more and more, and you just never get fulfilled.
right.
Um, so let's go into these different frequencies. Let's talk about like the different levels of radio waves
Right.
and microwaves and what the research says and what this means for us as this progresses.
Yeah. So, really, when you get down to it, the immune system works via the interactions of molecules that are vibrating in space. And you have to understand that those molecules, when they match the right frequency, then their sort of potential is unlocked, right? And the old lock and key mechanism, which is the old idea of how proteins work, is that a protein recognizes something else, right? Whatever it is, the same way that a lock might fit into a key might fit into a lock. But it's really more about frequency. Proteins are really a lot more like antenna than they are like keys. And this is really important because if you change the way that a molecule vibrates, you radically alter what that molecule does. And what the immune system is constantly trying to do is sort out the things in your environment and know friend from foe, your own proteins from other proteins of bacteria, viruses, whatever. And then when it figures out what's non-self, it has to say, is this a threat or is this not a threat? And it does this based on these molecular interactions. So at the most fundamental level, the disruption of the normal electromagnetic environment, in other words, the frequencies and the energies around us, the minute you start messing with that, you start messing with the relationship of the immune system. So people would obviously say, well, okay, that's great. That sounds nice. It sounds like it probably fits in a textbook, theory, but what's the actual data? So there's a lot of different ways that we can study the immune system. And one of those, I think it's actually one of the most simple systems to study because you can pull somebody's blood out and you can take their white blood cells, you can microwave them, you can not microwave another sample, and then you can look at the difference between the two of them. And we have data going back 30, 40 years, before I was born, showing that you change the behavior of white blood cells and other arms of the immune system, components of the immune system, when you subject them to microwave or radio wave radiation. And how could anyone assume, based on this data, that we might not have negative effects on the immune system in some cases, and maybe potentiating or positive effects in others? There's an explosion of medical devices out there called PEMF devices, which are pulsed electromagnetic frequency devices. And quite frankly, I don't think any of the people using them really understand what they're playing with. I think they're playing with fire, and I don't use them in my practice. I'm happy that people are getting good outcomes with them, but what are we really doing? We're changing the electromagnetic environment of the patient to get an outcome, to change what they're experiencing. And there's no question that this affects the immune system. And if you look at what people are using these PEMF devices in order to treat, it's all these diseases where we see immunological abnormalities. And astronauts are very instructive in this, right? No one is more divorced from the native electromagnetic environment of Earth than an astronaut who's under artificial light, no gravity, no connection to the electromagnetic energies of the Earth. And what happens in astronauts? Their immune system basically shuts down, and their viral replication and their viral levels go up. So these viruses that are not present in the astronauts when they're on Earth suddenly emerge when the astronauts are in space. And when you bring the astronauts back to Earth, the viruses go away. So and these are people, right? We know exactly what they're eating. It's engineered down to a T. Like the astronauts are some of the most studied people as far as what they eat. And their life support systems, obviously, we have those quantified down to a science. And yet we see these changes in their immune system that are based upon a change in what is fundamentally their electromagnetic or their light environment. And so the other key thing that I point out to people is that we see a generalized inflammatory response in lab animals and in isolates from animals and humans when we subject those isolates or those animals and humans to microwave radiation. In other words, the inflammatory response goes up. And this makes sense because microwave or radio wave radiation is a signal that the environment is changing rapidly. And whenever the environment changes rapidly, the bugs and microbes that you're dealing with are going to change in terms of what's out there for your body to have to deal with. And so there's no question in my mind that microwave and radio wave radiations have a profound effect on the immune system in order to both increase inflammation and decrease natural immunity, which when you think about it is the perfect storm for creating viral pandemics. And many people have made a lot of hay about the fact that 5G has rolled out, and I'm one of them, 5G has rolled out in the last 3 or 4 months. Everyone I know in alternative health and wellness is on the same page on this one. The only people who think 5G doesn't matter to our infectious risks and pandemics and things like that are people who don't know the literature, or they are basically industry-funded patsies or government mouthpieces whose handlers, the people who control their paychecks, those people would fire them if they went against, say, the party line. And at the end of the day, those people are employed by the government or by universities or whatever because they don't rock the boat. They have conventional, normal, uninformed opinions on these things because the system doesn't want this message getting out there because it's too destructive to too many economic invested interests, particularly, basically the whole global political and economic. Our political and economic elite, their power is completely dependent upon microwave radiations. If tomorrow every American put down their cell phone, everyone from Kim Kardashian to Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton would have less power. Yep. And like it or not, the people who are brokering power don't want to give it up. But at the end of the day, people need to realize this is having an impact. And I'd be curious what your thoughts are in talking to people, because one of the things I struggle with personally is how much do I change my life around this? And, we've both commiserated with one another. How much can we mitigate our risk without completely
becoming a monk
from normal life?
Becoming a monk. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Or a hermit. Yeah.
Yeah. It's tough. And, a lot of the people that, when I talk to them, if they've got sleep issues or things like that, or, try unplugging your Wi-Fi router. And then the majority of the people, I had a young mother one time that was like, my baby's not sleeping at all. And I was like, where's her crib at? And she goes, well, it's here. I said, where's your Wi-Fi router? She goes, oh, it's on the other side of the wall. And I said, unplug that thing. And I know it's anecdotal, but immediately she said within a day, her baby started sleeping, and people will always say, well, the dose, it's all about the dose. It's all about the dose. Of course, if you live right next to a cell phone tower, you're going to have problems, or you live right next to a power line. But, we've got millions and millions. Isn't there so much microwave and radio wave radiation now that we created like a man-made electromagnetic field around the Earth?
So here's
I saw something about NASA. NASA had a statement about that.
Yeah, here's the rub. The reason we use microwave and radio wave radiations to communicate is that they bounce around inside of the Earth's atmosphere. The problem, right, is that, like, let's say that blue light, you have a blue flashlight, right, or any visible light, and the light goes out and it gets reflected off of things, and if it's strong enough, you can see it from space, right? But that visible light escapes the atmosphere. It goes away, okay? Right. And if you shine it on a living thing, then that organism can do a lot of things with that light, right? Like if you get into a sauna, or if you stand in front of a heat lamp, you absorb that energy, and that energy does something inside of you, and your body can use it to do work. Here's the problem. No living system has an antenna that's set up to accept and then, alter microwave and radio wave radiations. And we're producing them at this insane pace. Right. And I bought a meter when I got interested in this because, I can look in the sky and see the air pollution. I can check the ozone levels. I can check the smog report. I have all these tools that I can do. I can look at pollen counts, and I can send the water off to be tested, and I can send my blood and my urine and my hair, and I can get all these tests to figure out what's in my environment, right? I have no test for specifically microwave and radio wave radiation exposure. And so I bought some meters, and I was shocked by how high the levels were. And what shocked me most was how much higher they were than what we would naturally be exposed to prior to the invention of the radio. And I thought, my gosh, this is orders of magnitude different. And we have no idea what the long-term health outcomes are. And this is the big problem, is that when you create a stress on a system, you see the effects sometimes 10, 20, 30, 40 years later.
Especially if it's a low-level stress. You talk about, if you go down my my rabbit hole, when I got my infection from a pedicure, the stories of women that had gotten low-level, staph infections from, shaving their legs or whatever, going in before they had a pedicure. They cut my foot open. That's how I ended up getting infected. Yeah. But, these women that had these low-level staph infections for years, and then one day they had a heart attack or a stroke from this low-level, constant stressor. And, what happens when you live, especially with kids today, that have these low levels of stress, depending on how big a city you live in, all these different factors. Right. Throughout your whole life. And it might not be like zap, it kills you right now, but, especially, in nature, like we look at what's happened with animals with streetlights and artificial light at nights and how it's affecting their health, like in rodents and in bugs and all these things. And creeping death, a slow creeping death. Right. I don't know what's worse, is like a quick blunt force trauma or being killed by 1,000 paper cuts, Yep. And the thing I hate, the thing I want to put information out there, so people can kind of think about this stuff for themselves, but I also don't want to create massive fear. I don't want people, because I think sometimes, if you have this fear, that, there's this thing out there, it almost creates more stress than if you didn't even know. Right. But at the same time, I think there's things that you can control, like turning your devices off, at the end of the day, like hardwiring your computer, turning your Wi-Fi off, only using it when you have to, choosing to live in a more rural area as opposed to living downtown, getting outside for sun breaks, drinking plenty of water, because we know one of the side effects of having this microwave world is dehydration. When you stick steak in the microwave without having a paper towel over top of it, you end up with this dry, worn out piece of meat. So, I love talking about this stuff because I think people need to think about this stuff for themselves, especially as we go down this road of, your refrigerator being smart and your stove being smart and your, is that really the world you want to live in, where your stove and your freaking toilet and your your freezer are all spying on you, and the government says, no, your temperature was too high in your house today, or it was not low enough, or it was, you're using too much energy, you're not allowed to do that. Right. Or why are you doing this activity? You had too many drinks today. Your health, your health insurance is going to go up. And people look at me like I'm mad, but it's the truth. I mean, that's what they're doing in China right now. You literally get social credits if you play according to the government's rules. And all of a sudden, what if all the vegans all of a sudden are making the rules and you're not allowed to eat meat, or, you're not allowed to do whatever? Like they say, weightlifting is barbaric and it's toxic masculinity, and you're not allowed to weightlift. Right. We don't want a culture. We don't want more masculine men, or we don't want strong women. So you're not allowed to weight lift now because that's, when you put people in charge, they always, if you look at history, it seems to attract sociopaths, right?
It does.
And then
Absolutely.
all of a sudden we have this system of 24-hour, 65 day a week, a year surveillance that you can totally control people without even trying. You
Right.
don't need to have militaries. You don't need to have all these things. You can just turn it off. Like, okay, you don't have access to your bank account. You don't have access to the store. You're not allowed in the store because you didn't play by the rules. That's the scary part of all of this. And I hate to be alarmist, and I didn't really think this would go down this rabbit hole, but we need to start thinking about like what we want our lives to be like, and what liberty, like, do you really want to give up all your freedoms for comfort? And in
Right.
the end, those comforts are probably going to cost you your health.
Yeah, as we've been talking about, the irony is that there are things that people perceive that they want that don't end up making them happy. And the irony to me of this is that this is like plastered all over throughout the texts that are foundational to human civilization and philosophy. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the Analects of Confucius or the Tao Te Ching or the Chuan Tzu or the Wen Tzu or the Bhagavad Gita or the Mahabharata or the Holy Bible or it's all throughout all of them. They say your desires do not make you happy. This material comfort and wealth that you can have in life and the adulation or adoration of other people may be a fleeting pleasure, but it is not true happiness. And when people come to me, the question is always basically, hey, I have a problem in my life that's preventing me from achieving my goals. And I always explain to people, we all have some things we want to do in this life, and we're willing to risk our lives for them, right? Like, if you want to be the world's greatest surfer, you need to take some risks, right? And likewise, if you want to be the world's greatest computer programmer, you're running different risks.
Right.
And I explain to my patients, you're here basically because you're not happy with the outcome of your decisions. Hippocrates said, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I can't quote him exactly. He said, diseases do not come upon us out of the blue. They are the result of many small sins against nature. And it's so key for people to understand that. Really, the diseases that we see that are not, overwhelming infections or accidental toxic exposures or injuries, right? Traumatic injuries. These are things that, the modern diseases of degeneration, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, obesity, a lot of the chronic infections people are dealing with, cancers, right? These are things that are the result of our systems being out of balance. And I can save people from emergencies, but I can't restore them to health with drugs and surgeries. And the irony is that they all get depressed because they're so sick. And the reality is you got to take a really hard look at your life and say, what actually matters to me? If you're a tech CEO and you're dying at 40 and they're telling you that you need to lose a vital organ or a semi-vital organ, an organ that you would miss, like your colon, for example, in order to combat your disease and be able to get back to work, right? But the data on you getting better after that and living a long life is not great. You got all these other stresses in your life, right? Is it worth it to you to keep making 6 figures a year for another 3 years at the cost of your colon or the cost of 10 years of life later down the road or whatever? And this is where people need to really ask serious questions of themselves of what really matters to me. And what I find interesting about this is that people, the things that really matter to them are really simple and don't require any of this technology, don't require any of this cost. They want to, get educated and grow up and have a healthy, robust physical body, and they want to have some free time and have some friends and have some hobbies, and most of them want to have a family of some kind, whatever that looks like to them. It's getting more, interesting what that means every day. And then they want to grow old. They want to sort of like educate the next generation, raise the next generation, whatever you want to call it. Maybe that looks like being a kindergarten teacher who never has kids herself or himself, or maybe it looks like, having a family of 12, right? And then they want to have some golden years where they can kind of relax and rest on their laurels and enjoy life a little bit, and continue to teach people and give back to the younger generation. And then they want to like die peacefully without a lot of suffering. And none of that requires a cell phone.
It's true, and just I used to do a lot of high-end bodyguard work.
Yeah.
Back in my early 20s, and I worked for some of the world's richest, like multi gazillionaires I've been around, and people with boatloads and boatloads of money. And I've also spent a lot of time in third world countries. And it's interesting that the people that I've spent time around that had absolutely nothing, I didn't see depression. I didn't see people walking around saying, well, woe is me. I saw kids like rolling up a t-shirt and putting duct tape around it and playing soccer. And I saw laughing in front. And I did see some starvation, of course, but I saw people that had everything you could want, whether it be drugs or women, cars. And I seen, immense amounts of antidepressants, depression, suicide, insane, with people that have everything you could possibly want. And then on the other scale, like if you have a disaster in a third world country, they're like, well, it's just another day, right? Whereas if you can't go to the store here in the US, then all of a sudden it's like, or just imagine if they shut off the cell phones or the Wi-Fi here, there would be riots in the street. Yeah. So I know we've kind of gotten off topic a little bit, but
it is critical to talk about this, because the main roadblock to me with people that I've started to realize is I'm not trying to, and this blew my mind about, I worked very briefly at a very expensive wellness practice where I treated a lot of the kind of people who you were bodyguarding for. And what really just I keep coming back to since leaving that place is that they all wanted to spend a lot of money to get better doing heroic stuff that was really expensive, both in terms of time, money, and sometimes in terms of just the biological cost. And it's
but they weren't willing to sit outside in the morning and have a cup of coffee.
Exactly.
But they'd spend $300,000 on a red light tanning bed.
Exactly. And what blew me away was that there was just no substitute for doing things simply. And they wanted to make it complicated. And in some cases, what I began to realize is that, and this is where you get into, like at the end of the day, the people who don't get better are the people who there's some emotional component to what's going on. And one of the most typical examples is, like, for example, let's say like a young woman who's been abused, and her family won't admit it, or the perpetrator's still in her life and there's never been any justice or there's never been any closure for her. She ends up getting all these diseases that no one can figure out and no one can fix, and having all these complaints. And when you start talking to doctors who actually spend time with their patients and talk to their patients, they'll tell you that when you start to get those elephants in the room, in the picture, and start to talk about that kind of stuff, all of a sudden people start to get better. And what's really important about that is that people need to understand that, money is not going to solve these problems. It's not going to make you happy. In many cases, what I found was that the people who had all this money were able to just distract themselves from the conversation that really needed to happen. Right. They were able to distract themselves with trips to other countries, to other clinics, to the next doctor, the next supplement protocol, the next operation, surgery, whatever, when what they really needed was someone to sit down with them and really have a conversation about what's really bothering them. And obviously that's not always the case. Sometimes people need to kind of sometimes people need invasive, expensive stuff, right? I view it all as tools, just how often I use it and what price tag is on it. And I realized that the other thing is that most patients really know what they need to do. and particularly in like an hour or two, you or I can tell people most of the things they need to know in order to be really healthy. There's variations on that theme. They may need to cut this food that another person can get away with eating, or they may need to, get more sun than somebody else because of their skin type or whatever. But what's really blown me away as I get older is that the best medicine is actually selling people self-love and getting them to do what they already know they need to do.
Right.
They know what they need to do.
Take action.
And they get caught up in all the particulars. They're like, well, I can't quit my job because I'm counting on the paycheck because we have this house and we have this mortgage and I have this new car. And it's like, hey, like, downsize. Why do you need 5 bedrooms? You have 1 kid. Why do you need like 10 acres or 2 acres in the middle of the city? Buy a 1/4 acre lot in the woods, near a national park. And, people drive new cars and they buy new phones. And it's this whole keeping up with the Joneses thing, right?
Yep.
When people really take a minute to pay attention to what they want and what they care about, and what's really going to make the difference between them being satisfied with their life and not being satisfied with their life, the answer is never the next cell phone. It's always these basic things that they know, they crave, they desire, they want, and they distract themselves with all this other stuff. And that's where marketing is so dangerous. People have figured out how to hack the human brain, and really the human. I look at it as partly being the immune system, because if you're immune to marketing that gets you to buy bad crap that's not good for you, guess what? You are more robust, more resilient. And so being able to cut through the scam and figure out what the angle is really critical at this point. And that's why I focus on most of what I can teach people about how to be healthy. I can teach them in like an hour or 30 minutes, but it's getting them to have the right mindset and the self-love necessary to stop making excuses for not doing it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and even with fitness, like most of the people that come to me are usually, medicating themselves with alcohol or food or whatever because they're trying to fill a void in their life, and
Right.
A lot of people are doing that now with technology. So could you give us like a, obviously we don't want to create this fear, but
Right.
we need to have an awareness of there might be consequences in living in certain areas.
Right.
There might be consequences in having, living in a skyscraper in New York with, 10,000 people living in that skyscraper, and every one of them has 4 cell phones and 2
Right.
Wi-Fi routers.
Right.
Kind of give me your risk
10 smart
reward.
devices.
Yeah, I mean, give me your risk reward ratio of how you. I mean, you can talk about yourself. I mean, I could talk about myself.
Yeah. Right.
And the things we've done to basically say, hey, you know what, we're gonna use this technology, but we're not gonna let it use us.
Yeah.
We're gonna do some things to mitigate this stuff, and maybe people are gonna have to start making hard choices about where they want to live based on some of these consequences that you can't really say causation, but I think there's a very strong correlation between population density, technology, and humans struggling.
Right. Absolutely. And the real key to this too is basically that, the more fashionable your zip code and the higher paying your job, the more likely it is that if you get sick, then where you are is a good place to get better, And what I see is people making 6 figures a year as like computer programmers in like downtown LA or San Francisco or New York, and then they get sick and they hit the wall and they spend all their money on fancy wellness doctors, and then they show up at my office and I'm like doctor number 10, and I'm like, hey, have you ever like gone camping in the last 10 years? And they're like, yeah. I come to think of it, like when I road tripped across the country 2 years ago, it was the best I'd ever felt. And I'm like, are you serious? Like, that was not a hard thing to figure out.
Yeah.
I'm just a simple country. I tell my patients I'm just a simple country doctor, which is not entirely true, but It's very simple, and people don't need to make it complicated. And, as far as the risk like benefit breakdown, it's really tough to counsel people. And the key is to understand how it alters risk. So let's say that, 100 soldiers charge across a field that's, being sprayed with bullets, right? And only 10 of them die. Well, the 90 that ran across the field achieve their objective, and they may go on to lead happy, healthy lives, and never think twice about the bullets that they dodged, right? But you never know which group you're going to be in, the ones who take the bullet or the ones who get away with it. And this is not a 10-second sprint across a field. It's a multi-decade marathon across life. And the brain cancer literature in this is very revealing. So there's one of the best reviews of this was done in 2011, which I grant is 9 years old, but it was very comprehensive. And based on the studies that they looked at, they said, okay, there's lots of studies that show an association between cell phone use and brain cancer. But there's also studies that don't show an association. But we really need to dive into those numbers to ask some serious questions. The incidence of really severe brain cancer is like the kind that we detect before somebody dies. Because lots of people die who have brain tumors that never know about it. My mom has a benign tumor in her brain that's about the size of a baseball. And it was found by accident. And if the incidence of malignant brain tumors is 1 in 100,000, and I don't know if it is actually, but it's something like that, then if it doubles, then it's still 1 in 50,000. And that's still low enough that the average doctor on the ground doesn't notice. The average person doesn't notice. But you start talking to people and they're like, oh yeah, so-and-so's got cancer, so-and-so's got cancer, and the rates of cancer going up, and it's hitting people earlier and earlier. And you ask them, hey, wait a minute, did grandma or grandpa die of cancer? They're like, no, they lived to 90 because they ate beef liver and worked on a farm every day of their life. And you're like, huh, so they made it to 90 and they died in 1930. And they had access to antibiotics for the last 20 years of their life, and may not even have gotten them when they needed them, right? And you're telling me that you're falling apart at 20 or 30 years old. Well, that's not a genetic problem, that's an environmental problem.
Sure.
And so what people need to realize is that it's affecting the incidence of all disease, and it's raising all of them insidiously. And I'm exposed to all this stuff just like everybody else because I don't want to be a hermit. And I just know that, the things I've done and things I'm doing, the way that I'm building a practice and making money online is worth it to me because I can't give up on my mission of educating people as to what really matters to be healthy. Like I could be, probably semi-retired right now if I'd worked as hard just making money as I have at learning how to be a good doctor and reaching people, which is often a very thankless, at least economically, task. Sure. And so people just need to sort of ask some hard questions. Is what I'm doing so meaningful to me that if tomorrow I wake up and I have brain cancer, or if I end up being the poor guy who gets brain cancer at 50 and doesn't get to meet his grandkids, is it worth it? And there's no easy way to walk somebody through that scenario. But as they begin to see their health deteriorate, their mortality becomes apparent to them. And as they begin to see, and the number one thing, right, for me is seeing is believing, experiencing this is believing. People have got to just try and see how much better they feel. I mean, a lot of people will tell you, oh, I don't want to try this or that or the other thing because it's not worth it to me. But then they try it and they're like, wow, the difference is amazing. And this is key because it's not just your risk of long-term disease. It's your risk of how am I going to feel tomorrow, today, in a week. And with the stuff I've done over the last 3 or 4 years, my brain works better than it's ever worked. My mood's better than it's ever been. And you just see these stories of people who are like, yeah, and like your story, you were going to have your colon cut out because, you were eating gluten and dairy, and doctors didn't tell you to stop eating it, but you did, and you got better.
Well, the big factor was I wasn't sleeping, and I was working 12 hours a day, and right. I was in a gym from 5 o'clock in the morning till 10 o'clock at night, and not sleeping, and training like a maniac and taking stimulants, and
sure. So you did a lot of things, but if you'd asked yourself like a week before that crisis, hey, you're going to give up all that stuff, it'll be really good for you, you'll feel great. You would have been like, no, this is great.
And then that's, I had that big awakening, like, okay,
Right.
I started reading and I was like, what do I need to do? I need to walk outside. I need to learn how to reduce stress. I need to sleep more. There's these things that I can do, like changing my diet, that will help, but it was overall a change in lifestyle. And I was forced to, sickness is an amazing, amazing teacher. And then it happened again. I started meditating. I was able to manage my colitis, and then it kicked me square in the face again when I got my infection. And I learned, hey, not only do you have to take sleep seriously, and you have to, stress and rest and stop taking stimulants and all these things, you need to, get outside more. You're not in nature enough. So, we're constantly being reminded and told what we need to do. A lot of it is if we choose to listen or not, and if we were punched hard enough in the gut or in the nuts, so to speak. But yeah, it's, but I think, in the future, as our world goes down this technological, wonder world, mastermind, whatever you want to call it, people are going to have to make decisions on, what kind of life do they want to live? Do they want to live in a life with all these great technologies where their health might suffer,
Yeah.
and, or do they want to live a simpler life where they have more happiness and joy? I don't know. And we're going to adapt, and life's going to go on, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah.
But, that's the thing. These are all uncharted territories for us, and it's going to be interesting to see, how this all goes down.
Right. And, the COVID pandemic is an interesting example of this, because it's going to be most manageable in rural areas, because the rate of transmission is going to be lower, slower. You've got more people who are more connected to nature. A lot of them are eating or living a more natural lifestyle. And it's places like New York City that are being overwhelmed, not just because of all the microwave and radio wave radiation that's causing increased levels of inflammation and immunosuppression, but it's also the fact that, people there's such a high population density, and there's so much stress from just social and other factors. That's where you're going to see the system get overwhelmed. I mean, I've compared healthcare systems because I've worked all over the country, and New York ERs were busy 6 weeks ago, and now it's crazy. They're flying in doctors who don't even have New York licenses to just keep up with the demand. And it's like people think, oh, I couldn't live anywhere but New York. And it's like, well, is that worth taking a risk on a sort of black swan event like a pandemic? To me, no, because my happiness doesn't depend on anything that I get in New York City. And for other people, it's like, well, you got to make a decision. You got to realize that at some point, the stress of that is going to outweigh the perceived benefit to you. And you need to understand that. It's a trap that I see people falling into, where they think, I can do this forever. I can live here. I can hack it. I can handle it. But then, they end up, sick or unable to complete their job because of all the stress, and their physiology is just falling apart. Mm-hmm. And then they regret it. And that's what I want people to avoid. I want them to avoid that regret.
Yeah, well, Steve Jobs talked a lot about that in his book. It mentioned a lot about the regrets he had about, working as much as he did and doing as much as he did. And then, like the book Jack talks about, the monk who sold his Ferrari. About
it's a very different meaning. Stole his Ferrari.
Sold his Ferrari. I'm sorry.
I know.
For being in front of this thing. But the monk who sold his Ferrari, about the attorney in New York that basically was, living this high in life and had a heart attack and sold everything and then moved to the mountains. And I think all of this stuff, this COVID-19, this kind of reset that we're going through, is going to make people think about what's really most important to them. Do they want to live in this high tech world, where there's tons of stress, there's tons of comfort, but there's consequences that come with that comfort? Or do you
Right.
maybe want to live a more simple lifestyle where there's not as much stress? Like I know for me in the last week, like living out on the farm has been unbelievably relaxing and just so calm, and
Yeah.
compared to the normal life that I live. And you know, get me wrong, I love coaching people, I love training people, but you know, um, I think a lot of people would benefit from living a much simpler life than the life that's being kind of thrust upon us, keeping up with the Joneses, getting a bigger house, having a newer car, you know, traveling all, you know, going all over the place on these fancy vacations. And you know, I know for me, I'm going to do as much as I can to simplify things so that I can, um, you know, live the life that I want to live, which really doesn't require that much.
Right. Same here.
So, well, Doc, we've bantered on here for over an hour, and thank you once again for being on the show, and just give people a little rundown of where they can find you. And I hope you enjoyed this show, and then we'll be on with our day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. People can find me at my personal website, stillmanmd.com. I blog at medium.com. If you just Google Stillman MD, it'll come up. And I have an online course called Polar Bear Fitness at polarbear.fitness, where I teach people basically all the key information that I've found to make the biggest difference in my life and the lives of my family, friends, and patients.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Doc. Oop, I almost dumped the computer over. Thanks for chatting today, and stay safe and stay strong.